first morning session entitled My Crystal Ball, Exploring the At-Risk Achievement Gap and Its Connection to Our Sector with the presenter Sunil Iyengar. Let me first introduce, just by name and title, our three panel respondents. So please welcome, in order in which they will speak, Clay Lord, who is the VP of Local Arts Advancement and American for the Arts, Maud Lyon, President of Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, and Oliver Ragsdale, President of the Virgil H. Carr Cultural Arts Center. Welcome. And just a few words about our presenter here, Sunil Iyengar. He is the director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the NEA, and during his time there, they've had an extraordinary run. They have created an art system map, a long-term research agenda. They've launched a research grants program. Sunil, in addition to a parade of significant papers that have come out of his office, has really launched new partnering with organizations like the Brookings Institution, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Institutes of Health, to study the arts in relation to such topics as economic development and the health and well-being of older adults. I was a little bit a part of the work, seeing how the NEA is fostering conversations that have never happened before at the federal level around creative aging. And as I heard a colleague say the other day, Sunil is the researcher most quoted in the major media since Masters and Johnson. Sunil, come.
I'll put it over there. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. A lot of thanks are due. First of all, I want to thank Aaron Dworkin for inviting me here to address this topic. I also want to thank the great folks at SphinxCon and, of course, my distinguished panelists and Eric for that very warm introduction. Most of all, I want to thank you for not sleeping in. So I'm going to talk about this topic, I have to say, in all candor, was assigned to me by the good folks at SphinxCon. And my crystal ball, I am, as a researcher, I don't get many chances to prognosticate. I have to look at the data and therefore construct an argument. So I actually do relish the chance toward the end of this to make some modest predictions or forecasts. But essentially, what I mean here by at-risk, when we talk about at-risk, there are obviously many ways to go about thinking about at-risk populations. For the purpose of this short presentation, I'll be focusing on at-risk youth, particularly children, adolescents, and when we say at-risk, I'll be focusing particularly on those with lower socioeconomic status. That typically means their lower parental income, education for these kids. And what benefits are we talking about? Plausible benefits. Well, they're quite plausible, in many cases demonstrable. Academic, civic achievement, engagement in academic, civic activities is clearly documented, as you'll see, close correlations between those who engage in the arts in a profound level and in turn realize these outcomes. But I also want to talk a little bit about a couple of other outcomes. These are more of a mouthful: socio-emotional, neurocognitive, but they are actually the underlying mechanisms, as you'll see, I think, for how the arts truly works in generating these top two very externally observable outcomes: academic and civic achievement. So I'm going to start by showcasing a study that a report we released a couple of years ago. And I'm sorry to say we ran out of print copies. This has been through our second print run. It's a pretty popular report. It's online on arts.gov, and we will issue copies if people would like them. But this is one of my favorite reports because it has the unique distinction of having Yo-Yo Ma cite it in an arts organization meeting. And I don't often get to hear world-renowned artists talk about NEA research directly. So this is a report that was done with the researcher, and this is called Arts and Achievement in At-Risk Youth. And it was done by a researcher we commissioned, James Catterall, who studies creativity and education policy. He was formerly at UCLA, and he'd written a book called Doing Good and Doing Well by Doing Art. And I was really kind of taken by some of the analysis in that, and I asked him to kind of push it a little further. And so he looked into 4 longitudinal databases. These are large national databases. We know the government knows all kinds of things about us, and in fact tracks a lot of kids over time, so that you can see in early childhood and as elementary school kids what experiences they're having and how many times they might take an arts class or lesson, or be doing some extracurricular activities with the arts or music. And then it also tracks a lot of other variables, so you can see what's going to happen to them later in life. And so these are 2 by the Department of Education and Labor, maintain these data sets. So he went into them, and he looked at children, teenagers, and young adults. He looked at the continuum of the lifespan and what's going on, particularly with academic, social, and civic outcomes data. And in an ideal study, you would want to sort of do what's called a control group. That is to say, you would want to follow a group of kids who get arts exposure, compare that to kids with similar backgrounds and characteristics, and see if you remove the arts, so to speak, would they also fare as well as the kids with the arts. Let's put aside ethical reasons, just say that was not the way we approached this. The way we approached this is we looked at these data sets, because it's retroactive, and he basically looked at the kids who were in the the lower end of the socioeconomic status backgrounds. That is, these are the kids with the lowest family incomes, education status, compared them to the general population, and in some cases to those kids in the higher range of socioeconomic status, to see if, even if you're in the lower SES group, and you plausibly don't have access to many of the benefits that other people enjoy and the other kids will be having at the higher end, what will happen if you do get high exposure to the arts, like more intensity of exposure to the arts versus those kids? So you don't have to read the fine print. I'm just going to tell you briefly, and this is sort of a pattern. I'm not going to show you a lot of this, but this is one example, and this is an academic achievement outcome. So what we're looking at here is the average science test scores of 8th graders who have had a history of intensive arts exposure, both in terms of in class, in school, and out of school kinds of activities. And what you see here, if you just look at the right-hand bar, you're looking at the overall bunch of kids in this database. And that includes kids in the higher SES group, more income, where their families had higher levels of income and education. So they are actually performing the best. And you would expect that. You would expect that because they may have had access to other experiences and academic opportunities and so forth that put them give them that edge. But then if you look far to the left, you see this is the lower SES group who don't have, and this is particularly those of that segment of that population who did not have arts exposure intensely. So they are actually faring the worst. And in the middle, you see those who have high arts exposure and yet are low SES. And you can see they're doing substantially better than the kids in the lower SES group who did not have intense arts exposure. They're not at this point in their lives, they're not performing as well as those in the higher SES group or the general sample. And the reason, I know this is a bland-looking chart, and you would think the NEA would have I'd have better visuals for you, more aesthetically pleasing. But I do want to point out that it is actually kind of an apt metaphor. I mean, what you're seeing here is they're a step above the other step, and it's an ascending pattern. And that you're going to see predominantly occurring in academic achievement. You see that with the share of 10th graders who go on to complete a high school calculus course, again, outperforming those of their cohort, their peers who did not have higher arts exposure. You see that in some cases they're even slightly outperforming the general sample. This is actually the mean GPA of high school students at intense arts exposure. And this is what's called a negative indicator. You're looking actually at a percentage of kids who did not go on to complete high school, either dropped out or just didn't finish it. And here you see, lo and behold, the middle bar, which you should be paying attention to, is showing the lowest percentage. They're actually only 4% of people from that cohort dropped out or didn't complete high school, compared to 22% of their peers, and actually 7% of the general sample, which includes the high SES kids. Now, again, you see this over and over. Do they earn a bachelor's degree? Yes. Do they enroll? Do they, they actually went to more selective colleges than their peers? now we start to see something different. What we're showing here is civic engagement. And you see that 12th graders who had higher arts exposure in the middle and were from low SES backgrounds actually outperform not only the other low SES kids, they outperform the overall sample. So we were interested in this civic engagement stuff. And we looked at something like participating in school service clubs, where in fact, if you look at the right-hand bar, those are again the high SES kids, but they're actually the high SES kids who had high arts exposure. They're clearly front of the pack. But if you look to the bar we were accustomed to tracking, which is the second from the left, high arts, low SES, you will see that the gap has been significantly reduced between them and the low arts, high SES kids, if you're following me. So if you're in the high SES group and you don't engage in the arts much, your chances, your engagement in civic participation is about the same as those in the low SES group who actually have high arts exposure. And this is, again, an interesting pattern we see over and over again when we look at civic indicators. Volunteerism, volunteering in their communities, we looked at voting, so forth. So what is really responsible for this? And I have to just stress here, as a good researcher, well, trying to be a good researcher, this is all correlational. We're only saying, this is still very powerful, I think, but we are not saying that the arts exclusively cause those benefits. We'd like to investigate that hypothesis, but it is essentially correlational. That said, I think the next step, and this is what you're starting to see in the field, certainly in academic research and increasingly in the practice in the community arts practitioners, in teaming up to get at these two specific outcomes, which are really basic, I would suggest, mechanisms of action for academic and civic engagement. That is to say, socio-emotional benefits that inhere from the arts, as well as neurocognitive. Now, what do we mean by that? So, socio-emotional pathways to learning. So we do know, and I don't need to delve into research to tell you, kids are just more engaged in learning when they feel good about what they're learning, when they don't have obstructive patterns of thinking that block that don't permit their growth. And of course, the arts allow you to regulate emotion, which is essentially key to learning and has been shown to be a big predictor of learning. So I don't know how many of you have heard of you must know Head Start is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. It's an early childhood program across the country. They give grants to for schools to do these programs for at-risk kids. These are 0 to 5, so very early stages. And there's one of the things that's been really fascinating to watch as a researcher is how some people have started to look at these programs where they do include the arts very heavily and programs where they don't include the arts that much. And this is one specific program. Eleanor Brown is a researcher at Westchester University, that's her, who's done a couple of really marvelous studies on this topic. And she looked at basically the growth in school readiness, the degree to which in these at-risk populations, early childhood, arts enrichment, that is to say where you get arts class, in this case music, dance or creative movement, and visual arts, alongside equal time, if you will, with what would be called the early learning curriculum. And she found in that school, which is Kaleidoscope Preschool Arts Enrichment Program in Philadelphia, she found distinctive benefits. They were definitely having greater achievement over time in school readiness as measured by this checklist. They had no evidence of achievement gap based on race and ethnicity, which was significant. And there seemed to be an advantage for kids with developmental delays. That is to say, they actually were growing in their acquiring school readiness skills at the same rate of those who did not have developmental delays to begin with. And that's important because developmental delays in learning are clearly linked to poverty. And we know a lot about how poverty works on development. So, where she took it up a notch was really looking at the school and a comparison group, as we've just been saying. And there's something called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, where you show a picture to a kid or anybody, and you can get it basically tests what's called receptive vocabulary, because they'll then give some words in response to the picture, and you get a sense over time of how much of a vocabulary they have. So she looked at that, and she did indeed find an advantage for the arts-enriched program. Here's another, what might be considered a bland image, but I like it. arts, the score is way higher on this test than the kids in what you might call a typical early learning program. So then she said, okay, but what is really driving this academic, this future preparation for academic this preparation for academic achievement that seems to be seeded by the arts? And her theory was it's really social-emotional skills. So, these are some of the positive emotions that clearly have been linked in literature with learning, emotional regulation, being able to cope with negative problems, and use negative emotions, anger, dismay, use them at the right times if you're going to use them. I'm not an emotional psychologist, as it probably shows, but there is a lot of literature on this. And her next study was she administered these tests where she did try within the same school, first of all, to know whether kids were just happier when they were doing the arts component of the curriculum. So I've just described a curriculum where you have our early learning curriculum standard, and then you have the rest of the art stuff. And she looked, and they were actually showing more involvement, interest, happiness, pride in those classes. But then again, comparing it to a comparison group, and it turns out that there was more interest, happiness, and pride at these arts-enriched schools, in the school, than there was at the comparison group, and that over a year, there was actually greater growth in emotional regulation skills and the ability to cope with negative emotions as rated by teachers. And they're very strict protocols on what to observe and how to detect this. So again, very promising in terms of socioeconomic. And I'm pleased to say she's working right now on an NEA research grant. Can the arts get under the skin? Because her next step is to say, well, poverty, which we know from the literature is highly correlated with stress in these kids and anxiety. And one of the indicators of stress is the hormone cortisol. So she's actually measuring the physiological basis, if you will, for how the arts, these kids who get high arts exposure might be perhaps reducing their stress levels over time. And so we're interested in seeing what comes of this. Now, I'm just going to quickly go into this second piece here, neurocognitive pathways. So we talked about emotion regulation and happiness and pride and so forth. But let's move over to what goes on in the brain. And Nina Kraus is a researcher who's been looking at trained musicians over time, older adults and kids. And she's teaming up, some of you may know, the Harmony Project in LA. The First Lady has talked about it. It's a program where they take kids in gang reduction zones and they give them opportunity to have free musical training. And there's actually a big wait list for this. And at around 6 months or so, these kids typically get free instruments and get to play with each other in groups. So she looked at these kids, and she has a theory, and it's again stuff that at the time before she came on the scene, I would argue it was largely happening in kind of basic research studies. But she brought it into the population. The idea that neural processing of speech, identifying stop consonants, being able to listen closely, which we know is closely correlated with language and literacy. She looked at that capability and said that those people who have high exposure to music training probably are going to demonstrate higher neurophysiological processing of speech. And so she looked at these students, and indeed that was the case. It wasn't the case after 1 year, but after 2 years of this, there were significant enhancements of neural function and processing of speech sounds. And of course, as we said, that's linked to reading and language skills. The second last piece with this is Mariel Hardiman at Johns Hopkins University, who considers herself a neuroeducator. She looked at, so let me just step back and say, when we talk about what is the academic benefit of the arts, a lot of us think, we sometimes glibly say it's transfer of learning. What does that mean? Well, some people posit that maybe it's that you learn the arts really well and somehow that domain knowledge magically transfers to your ability to do math and all these other things. What we're saying here is it's probably it has a lot to do with emotional engagement, engaging the person's whole being. And memory, when we talk about memory, is not just, in a sense, going on in the brain. There's kinesthetic memory, there's learning through visual cues, and so forth. And she's positing that it's really memory retention that's happening when people experience the arts. That is to say, it's much more of a profound engagement with that art form that transfers, if you will, to their engagement in other subjects. And in fact, in one Baltimore elementary school, which was 98% African-American students, and they happen to be, this was actually, this is very much an at-risk population in terms of eligible for free or reduced price meals, that particular school anyway. And she looked at two units, looked at two arts integrated units compared to two conventional science units. So in this arts integrated unit, they were using science to teach, they were using the arts to teach science concepts. And the thing she did is she tested these students before, after, and then what's called a delayed test about 2 months later, just to see if they retained those concepts. And again, what you see here is that on the right, the kids in the arts integration program had higher retention in that delayed test of what they had learned than those kids in the control group. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean these kids are doing better academically, but it tells you the underpinnings of that academic achievement, that they are actually retaining more. And what's even more significant, I think, for this topic is when you look at the kids who are considered basic readers, maybe because of developmental deficiencies or on their own, they just aren't reading as well as they should be for their age, they actually fared the best. And again, this is a theme, I think, with this literature, is that those who are sort of the most at risk or the most prone to not doing well in the traditional sense are somehow reaping the best benefits from the arts, and it's leveling the field, it's bridging the gap. So finally, we get to my last slide. So I don't want to disappoint you, but I will try to make some prognostication. It may not be as bold as I would have hoped, but if I was talking to a group of researchers, I would have stressed this stuff, like this is what we need to do next for the research, and we can talk about that in the research interest. Because a lot of these studies I've talked about, while very pivotal and important, are very small-scale studies, and we do need to understand in more larger, diverse populations what is happening. But my prediction here, bear with me for a moment, is that we often will think about, you've heard of the topic STEM to STEAM, and there's almost some kind of angst or interest among people in the arts to push the arts into STEM. I don't think we need to do that. I think what's going to happen is the STEM people will come to the arts, and I believe that in a big way. Talking to people at the National Science Foundation, talking to people at universities and places where they make science policy, even the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, strongly believes that we can't afford as a society, as we know, to neglect the outcomes for this population. And it's just going to, it's a national security issue almost. It's an economic issue for sure if we don't attend to this generation and these populations. And the arts will have to be, perforce, used to engage these kids and to get them to enjoy and to experience academic learning. And so I do think STEM is you're going to find that science, technology, engineering, and math, those disciplines which we often think of as off to one side here, are actually going to become more central as players and as people who want to engage community arts groups to build up and to bridge that gap. So I think there's a lot of room for potential partnership. Now that said, I don't know if you know Bob Putnam. He wrote Bowling Alone a while back, and he was talking about the declines in civic participation. He's at Harvard. He's a researcher there. He sent me the slide a while back, and even though it's using old data, I think it's important to know that the gap, unfortunately, seems to be growing. That is to say, the top is the high SES group, the bottom is the low SES group, and their access to music, dance, or art classes outside school. And we even know from more recent data that, unfortunately, the disparities persist. And so one of the big things we need to rectify is that disparity. And in doing so, give people the access to those larger benefits. There's a President's Committee on Advisory Committee on the Arts and Humanities, which has released a report just as I was doing this a week ago, which shows I think it's about 8 or 7 schools that were turnaround arts schools, which are essentially using full arts integration, high quality arts integrated into other curricula, and they have shown really tremendous benefits in a short period of time, about 2 years, compared to schools of their general characteristics. So that's promising. And I'll just plug this. If you'd like to go to our website, we have a lot of information about one of the partnerships that was mentioned with the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, National Institutes of Health, where we're trying to bring this information out to the public through webinars and occasional reports. Thanks a lot for listening to me. Way too long. Sorry for the length.
Let's hear some additional perspectives. Clayton.
So I'm at Americans for the Arts, and for the majority of the work that we do in this area, what we're focusing on is advocacy. Our arts education department is actually housed inside our government affairs department, specifically because what we're interested in is the advocacy for more arts education, for access to art as a mechanism for helping youth, at-risk youth, education in a lifelong way. And one of the things that's interesting about that when you think about arts education is that it's actually one of the few areas in the arts that has a substantial body of literature that is science-based that says that arts education works to do a lot of things. And so you would think that that actually makes the case-making a little bit easier. And it's interesting for me to think about why that's not happening. Well, the case-making is happening and we are making progress, but you know, for example, arts are nationally a mandated subject in school. And yet, art is not equitably taught in schools to the point that, depending on who you talk to, there are actually schools who are technically doing illegal work by not providing the amount of art that they need to, but they're not called on it in any way. When you ask people, how much, like whether they support more arts in schools, 93% of them will say yes. When you start asking them whether they support things like levies or more teachers who teach art in schools or more training for teachers in schools, those numbers go way down, which is kind of the way things go a lot. People want a lot of good things, but if they have to sacrifice in any way, or particularly if they feel like they're going to have to put into a pot in order to create an equitable system, but that means that their kids are not actually going to experience a different, these kids over here are going to experience a difference, they're less inclined to participate in that conversation. And so for us, this giant pile of information, and there's more of it, there's always more of it. Kids who participate in 4 years of arts education in high school score 100 points higher on average on the SATs than kids who don't. Kids have a lower dropout rate. Kids have a higher rate of going to colleges. All of that information is there, and we are very excited to be able to use that, but what it comes down to is a question of public will, a question of a public understanding of what it means to integrate arts into education, which is a lot more complicated than simply saying, well, my kid got to paint a picture today, or I don't really need to deal with that in my school because I have enough money that I can have my kid do dance classes after school, and that's how I'm going to deal with that. I think the other thing I wanted to touch on briefly is that you can't actually talk about the inequalities of arts education with also talking about the inequalities in our education system. And that is a really thorny area that is, I think, a bigger question for how we as a sector can have that conversation. The education system in America, for example, is primarily funded through local taxation. And that means that communities that have less in terms of revenue for taxes provide lower quality education in a lot of different ways. And one of the issues that we have right now is that the arts are considered one of those areas where you can lower the quality and lower the expense and still come out with mostly okay kids. And I think that comes back to public will. It comes back to the perception of arts as a frivolity. And I think that's where the kind of movement needs to happen in terms of having conversations with people and saying that arts education matters for all of these reasons, and also that we understand that the education system itself is inequitable, that we understand that the way that arts education has been integrated into schools and in after-school programs historically has been inequitable, and that we together are trying to make changes happen and make the art making and the integration of arts into the STEM activities and into all subjects something that is happening systemically, that is being done in a coordinated way among the national agencies, the state agencies, the local agencies, individual organizations, and schools, so that there, in the end, is a conversation happening that's much more about equitable access to arts education for all than is what's happening right now.
Thank you. Just to note, before I give it to Maud, fascinating the extremes we've just heard in the last few minutes, from Sunil proposing that we're on the verge of arts as a national security issue, and then the lack of public will that actually maybe sees arts as frivolity. That's like the opposite ends of the same spectrum that we're looking at. Maud, what are your thoughts?
Well, in looking at this, I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming. And I found myself thinking, we spend all this energy trying to build a better case, and maybe what we really need to concentrate on is a better campaign. What are the ways that we as an arts community and a cultural community work with the schools to try to deliver these kinds of assets to the kids who most need them? I mean, it's what our country needs. I think my personal opinion is one of the reasons that arts is so important is that pays attention to the individual person, and that gives voice to kids in a way that other things do not, and it really brings out the person that's there and allows kids to have a lot more self-confidence and skills. And I was particularly interested in your emotional, the increased emotional ability to handle conflict and other things. So one of the things that occurs to me is here in Detroit, arts and culture has been taken out of schools for the last 30 years. I'm sure that's true in communities across the country. It's true in Philadelphia as well. And so what's interesting is that a lot of the arts and culture that's available to kids comes from our nonprofit community. Even if it happens in the schools, it's still provided by nonprofits from outside the schools. So I think we need to think about what's a better way that we can work with the school systems to do that. And here in Detroit, Culture Source, the organization I used to lead, is doing an interesting project with the Detroit Public Schools with the support of the Bosch Community Fund, a wonderful visionary corporate funder. And so here's what and this is just beginning, but just to give you an idea, this is something you might want to think about as well. The Bosch Community Fund funds STEM education and science. They've been working with Alicia Merriweather, who's the science curriculum leader at the Detroit Public Schools, and with the Cranbrook Institute of Science, and given them grants for every 7th grader to do a field trip. And Bosch asked Alicia in the Detroit Public Schools, what would it take, what would happen if we could do this bigger? What would that look like? And so Alicia started thinking of K through 8. She made up her vision of every field trip a kid would have in the Belle Isle Aquarium, the Michigan Science Center, the all different institutions, and not just all science. There's some dozen organizations. So Culture Source has been commissioned to basically do a study and look at how to pull these parts together. So it's meeting with the DPS educators to find out what their issues are with the cultural institutions. And a big issue, which was no surprise, is that cultural institutions don't know enough about the educational requirements. And so they design their field trips around what they're interested in teaching, as opposed to this is what a kid needs to learn at 4th grade in the 2nd semester. And and so having that in greater alignment so it supports the teachers better. And then of course there's logistical issues. Then meeting with the cultural organizations and saying, so what are your problems? And one of their problems is getting approved for Title I funding and getting paid on a steady basis. A lot of the nonprofits are small. This is a big issue. So looking at those issues, what they're putting together is a plan for K through 8, what this would look like, what it would cost for every kid K through 8th in Detroit Public Schools to get to go on these field trips. And part of it is also to have an evaluation program that would then chart the difference, yet again showing the difference of the kids who had all these field trips and those experiences to anchor that learning than the kids who did not, and so forth. And then the last piece of the puzzle is once the plan is together, Bosch will call together its fellow corporate funders and say to them, so how could we all make this happen? Would you like to fund this piece of the puzzle? Would you be interested? No, none of us can do the whole thing. How could we do that? And I think that's really visionary. And I think that's exactly what we need to do in order to try to solve this. It's not about making arguments. It's about coming up with some very practical solutions for how can we cut the Gordian knot and find better ways for the assets of, because I think the reality is that arts and culture is going to be taught in the nonprofit sector. It is not going to be, I mean, yes, we want curriculum leaders in schools teaching arts and all of that, and we would all advocate for that. But I think the reality is we have a lot of assets in our cultural institutions, and we need to find a better way for them to be connected to the schools and funded, and we need to form be more allies in making that happen.
Oliver.
No introduction?
Yeah, well, actually my thought is, you're in the thick of this every day over at the Carr Center. How's that perspective?
Well, I am not a researcher. Fortunately, my wife is a PhD, so she told me what a longitudinal study was. I get paid to make up stuff. And a lot of what I think about and spend a lot of time around is being a disruptor. So I want to disrupt the concept of at risk. And as I thought about this, I didn't think about it from an academic standpoint. I thought about it from a personal standpoint and from people. And I thought about the importance of the concept of Glee, the television show. And I thought about the young people, particularly middle school and high school students, who have those same skills that those kids in Glee had, who were singers and who were dancers, who were gay and who were handicapped and who were black and white, and all of those types of things. And what happens when they get lost because there's no opportunity for them? And that's the at-risk piece. I thought about So You Think You Can Dance, and the impact of So You Think You Can Dance, and the popularity of So You Think You Can Dance. And why is it popular? Why are people paying attention to it? Why American Idol has thousands of people who stand in line in cold weather or hot weather to audition to become a star. Clearly, many of them, not all of them, but many of them think they have talent. Some don't, though. But you all saw the auditions. But when you think about those types of kids who are in the system and have no outlet, and the role that cultural organizations have and the opportunity that we have to reach down and touch and pull those young people out. The practical research that I've experienced, we had a young guy who came into our building who was interested in musical theater. And we had partnered with another organization here in town to do a Broadway workshop one summer. So we sent him over to that. And he got involved in it and found his niche. He was a dancer, he was a singer, and being in that environment with 50 other kids who looked like him, who acted like him, who behaved like him, who had the same passions that he had, and he decided that he wanted to be in that organization, and he wanted to be in the school, the high school, with many of the other young people who were involved. When he went back to his school and told them that he wanted to transfer to this other high school, it blew up. And because he was a high academic student, him leaving that environment was going to drive down their numbers, but it significantly was going to hurt him. They disassociated with our organization because they thought we were the poacher. We didn't have anything to do with it. That's how the kids get lost. And I think that's the kind of challenge that we have in this at-risk situation. How do we make sure that young people who have the creativity that is not quashed because of they only get one piece of good paper to draw whatever it is that they're doing, or that there's no outcome, no outcome for the work that they're doing and no outlet for it. But I think it ends up also having some pretty significant social implications today. I play at my church a few times a month, and in that environment, our lead musicians don't have training and don't read music. So our new method of learning music is YouTube. So I get these videos of YouTubes of arrangements and are challenged. Frankly, I'm a classical musician and didn't learn to learn music that way. So I have been really challenged, sometimes frustrated, but finally figuring out what incredible set of gifts it is to be able to make that happen. But it also creates limits of the possibilities. And we begin to see it in the Black church. If you look at choirs in the Black church, you begin to see a big age gap. A lot of choirs, the average age is 50 and up. If you think about that, 50 and up, that's when music started to come out of the schools. And so that early exposure that kids were having to be in a choir and get excited about being in a choir no longer exists. And so now we have a choir that the average age is 67 or 70 years old, and no young people who are coming up to fill the bill. So we have a different kind of at-risk that I'd like us to be thinking about and participating in as cultural organizations.
Fantastic. Let's open it up to some questions from the audience. I mean, the range, not just the fascinating 4 different perspectives on this issue that are represented in our chairs here, but also the range of questions and where the disruption elements from the extreme of basically a redefinition or a definitional conflict about what art is on one end of our conversation, all the way down to the finite focus of the research that provides a different kind of learning. What are the questions we can ask these people that will illuminate some key part that will help you with taking this out of this room and out into your work? Are there questions? And yes, in the corner, and stand up and wait for a mic if you would. And please identify yourself, since we are streaming live, by the way, to a lot of other viewers.
Thank you. Noah Morrison. Sorry, it's early. So first, I think that the individual from the Carr Center did immediately with media and the arts, taking in that information and turning it into something that we can digest in a different way, in exactly the same way that the data was talking about. Second, I think that I, as working with a nonprofit, doing arts education, how can we move the conversation from the organization and what we're doing outside of public schools and have it be a policy question, and how can we bring that to the forefront of this program should end so that public schools take over what we're doing?
Responses up here?
Well, I actually was having a little bit of that same thought as I was listening to Oliver and Maud, because I worry that if we seed the ground that says that these should be mandated inside schools and taught in schools and be part of the education system, and we say instead that our nonprofit arts institutions who are providing really good quality work, that's the model. I feel like there's a problem there because, for example, there aren't a lot of science institutions who are saying that same thing. Mm-hmm. You know, there aren't a lot of math nonprofits out there who are trying to bring math into the schools because that's the best way for that to happen. So I'm not saying that the products that are being generated are either in school or after school are in any way not great. I fear a little bit of the sentiment that's gonna bring up if what we say is, okay, well, we're gonna figure out how to pick all this up for you, as opposed to we're gonna help you figure out how to pick all this up.
Well, let me respond to that because, and you know, yes, schools need to have, you know, arts curriculum. They need to have that built in. There is nothing that is going to replace. I think your example about the choir is really telling. You know, it used to be that there was a room full of band instruments, and they'd be, you know, awful and kind of beat up. But you didn't like trumpet, try flute, and you know that gave a lot of kids the opportunity to do stuff that literally just doesn't exist anymore. They just don't have that, and so there aren't musicians that are learning to play. There aren't, you know, it's. I mean, I'm fascinated because I thought kids were learning in choirs because they weren't learning in schools, and to hear that affecting choirs is really interesting. I think, so we as an arts community need to advocate that needs to be in schools. I totally agree with that. I think we also need to realize that the schools are under huge economic pressures, and we can, say all day long, you got to add this, you got to add that, but we've got to help them find economical ways of doing it, and outsourcing to us, the nonprofit community, it may be the most economical and efficient solution. So I would think of this as a partnership of how we work together, not a competition. And so we absolutely should support, the arts teachers in schools and the programs in curriculum. And what we need to do is understand better how we integrate with the schools and provide what they need. And we need to be their strong advocates to get them the funding that they need. But we also should see it as an opportunity. How much of your organizations do in arts education? It's an opportunity to really be able to provide services better that we provide.
And I think the other thing is that historically in the African American community, the community provided educational opportunities for people. Jazz is a great example. The whole apprenticeship, go to the club, learn the music by listening to the pros, and eventually you become a pro. And I think that there's a role and an opportunity, and even while the advocacy is going on and the amount of time that it takes for advocacy to take place, we have kids that are still going through the system. That clock is still ticking as well, and we don't want them to end up 20 or 30 years old and not having had the experiences. So we have to do something.
And I'll just add from my own experience that Maud, your mention of collective impact endeavors that actually help bring down the silos of separation that have really kept arts learning weaker because of its separation, they start to come down around these collective impact initiatives where a number of groups and existing assets come together to accomplish something that benefits all. And that's part of a way to overcome the separation between in-school and after-school, between community assets and school assets, and it's starting to come. Let's go for another question. I saw a hand over in this area. Yes, right here. And please stand up.
Hi, I'm Hillary North. I'm actually from a progressive school in New York City, and I think this research is actually really compelling. One thought I had actually in looking at it was thinking sort of more broadly about education and pedagogy, and why is it that in all these arts programs we see these higher outcomes? Is it about the content and the actual sort of cognitive engagement that happens in arts training, or is it also because the way we're approaching how we teach other subjects is something that also needs to be disrupted? And I work at a progressive school, so we're sort of looking at that. How do you engage kids in a science space to take ownership of their learning and to kind of follow their passions? So I think that that's something to look at. I also want to talk about sort of this connection between sort of connecting the dots. So we have the school system, and we're talking about sort of the nonprofit sector and the organizations that maybe support some of this work. And I think there's a missing piece that I believe it was Oliver is sort of pointing to, which is families and communities. And I'm just wondering if any of you can talk to that or speak to efforts that are being made to bring parents and caregivers into the equation. I think when we talk about at-risk, we're primarily talking about communities of color, and I just see a lot of places where we're not bringing parents and families along, and I think that outcomes in terms of sort of success of young people who are in the arts is, I would imagine, very closely linked to somebody supporting that young person in their family, in their community. And so are there efforts to kind of inform people of this kind of research and say, as a community, how can you invest and sort of help support this as well? And are there efforts to develop programs where, nonprofit is actually looking not just at the school program and the individual child, but sort of the larger sort of concentric circles that this kid is a part of?
Sunil or others?
Well, that was kind of that what you just said was really at the heart of why the NEA and a bunch of different agencies got together to look at the arts and human development broadly. the idea that you can't, even what we're talking about is just a slice of a very big, I don't know if it's a pyramid, but it's some kind of larger contextual material. So you're essentially looking at the fabric of the society and the community where that individual is rooted and trying to understand it holistically. And what that means in practical terms is these partnerships, and this gets back to maybe a question raised about how do you get the stuff in the schools and so forth, is it really has to be outside the silo. And that seems so obvious, but one of the things that works is by talking to groups like the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families or their Administration for Community Living. Now, these are just names I'm naming, and it may not mean a lot to some people here, but these are federal agencies that their entire mission is to focus on families or to focus on early childhood or to focus on one dimension. And if we can somehow insert the arts as it rightfully belongs in those other domains, I think, and what that means is, getting back to that question raised from the back, really reaching out from our comfort zone and getting there, as you're saying, and talking to families and caregivers about this work and promoting the research to them, I hope, but ultimately also bringing this to the attention of the science and technology and engineering community, and I really truly believe that the industry is supporting those, and it's more importantly in some ways the scientists, many of whom are artists and intuitively understand all this. If they could be allies in this cause, they would be tremendous allies for making sure that the arts have a rightful place for all communities.
And then we just point out, because Sunil is actually being a little modest here, that it's in fact the quality of the research that has opened doors to other agencies in the federal government, doors that have never been opened to conversations with the arts before. For all our earnest, oh, we're so valuable and we have all these great things you should love, and yeah, you have arts things happening, those partnering connections those doors have not opened
if I could just
until
say,
the research.
I would just want to add, and maybe this is one takeaway I would hope, is that if we're doing that, you realize it's at the national level, but those relationships can be emulated in your own backyard. Like there are local administrations for children and families, or all those other local governmental units and their stakeholders, and you can somehow get embedded with them. I think you're going to have really good, much more fruitful outcomes than pursuing it alone.
Just really quickly, from an advocacy perspective, because one of the things that we've identified as a real barrier is that often there is a desire on the part of parents to get more arts into their schools for their kids, but there's not necessarily the vocabulary. They don't have the same factoids on the tip of their tongue, things like that. And so our arts education team has developed a couple different things. One is called Encourage Creativity, and it actually launched a couple weeks ago. You can look on our website and find it. It's called Encourage Creativity. It's a package of like short videos that are designed specifically to kind of pack a bunch of facts inside a 30-second, 60-second, 90-second, 8-minute frame about what arts education does for kids. And it's got infographics and smiling people saying things, and it's a useful mechanism for people who aren't necessarily comfortable standing up in front of a PTA and giving a presentation, and they can instead point to this. And the other thing that they're actually working on now and will launch at the end of the year is something called the Navigator, which is meant to be a landing point for ground level advocates, whether that's parents or teachers who are interested in trying to have a conversation with their superintendent, and will be a kind of distillation of a lot of this research into the things that they're going to need when they've got 5 minutes before their meeting and they need to print something out so that they can talk through 10 points. So again, because we work in that very specific space that is about advocating for this stuff, I think that's not the same thing as getting into those families and working out the dynamics and instilling the value of arts in those families. It's much more for people who've already gotten there, but it's kind of crucial in order to bring this conversation forward, particularly in districts, which there are many of, that are very, very resistant to the idea of more deeply incorporating arts education.
A practical family situation in the urban environment, because the other thing we have to keep in mind is, in a city like Detroit is very different than what's happening in the suburbs. And that's a huge, and that whole diversity thing plays in terms of long term of who gets to participate as professionals. But from a practical standpoint, grandparents are a key piece to this puzzle, because the parents haven't had art. the grandparents had that experience, and we have found that reaching out to the AARP and other organizations like that have gobs of people who understand it and get it, and who also care about the children. And in some cases, the grandparents are the ones raising the children anyway. That kind of situation begins to work and has some pretty significant impact.
Plus, there are many more grandparents now, of course, than there ever were. So it's really,
right. And you know, they're in my generation that have had those experiences. We were the last good generation to have arts, you know, everywhere, as I see it, in the urban situation.
And I would just add, in terms of program examples, the one I've been working with a lot recently is El Sistema, borrowed from Venezuela, which actually intentionally is family and community involvement in this intensive after-school music program. 500,000 kids in Venezuela, but now 117 US cities involved and 62 other countries. We are flat out of time, and we barely got started. So what that proposes is these few minutes as we set up for the next session. Would you do me the favor of having a short conversation at your table about your own experience that directly relates to these huge questions that were on our plates and that we all have a direct stake in? What is it about public will? What is your role in relationship to what happens to arts learning for young people? And just take these few minutes to bring back home, reflect and bring back home to grab the key ideas you heard here and share them with your colleagues at the table as we set up for the next panel, right after we say thank you to our presenters for this panel. Thank you.